welcome again to everyone for joining us today for our EnviroHouse workshop on preserving food by freezing with the Center for Food Preservation Arts. Right before we get going, I want to ask this question about how much you already know about freezing food and whether or not you're familiar with the Center for Food Preservation Arts. And we're going to come back to this question about freezing food at the end too, to get a sense of how much you've learned today and where we can still improve and what you might want to hear about next time. So I appreciate your feedback here on how much you know, and this will help Hal in his presentation too with, speaking to your experience level. So if you can answer that question, that would be great.
And while we're waiting on that, I'm going to do a really short introduction of Hal, and then when he gets started, he can tell you more about himself and his experience. Hal will be presenting today, and he is the Executive Director of the Center for Food Preservation Arts. And I think, unless we have something else, Kyla, we can go ahead and let Hal start introducing while we're finishing the poll.
Sure.
And then we'll just pop this up. We'll show the answers to the poll while Hal is talking, and you can just see what the results were.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining. Right up front, I'm going to say my seasonal allergies are kicked in, so I may be muting my mic every now and then, but I'm not going away anywhere. I would like to think of the Center of Food Preservation Arts as a community resource. We are basically what's called a collaborative organization, as we work with others, nonprofits and other agencies to pursue our mission. And I'd like to just give a little background of how this developed. I have had the opportunity, and I use that word in quotation marks, to live through 4 major natural disasters. And they disrupted the food supply, so I became very familiar early on how fragile our food supply is. I'm sure you've probably heard that most stores only have 72 hours worth of food during a normal flow, and yet when something like the pandemic happened, you can see that it goes away very quickly. And I guess now that we're in a pandemic, I'm in my 5th natural disaster. But that's inspired me to work with volunteer organizations that respond to emergencies like CERT and ARES. And in that experience, I've seen that resilient communities have food systems that recover more quickly. And I believe that resilience comes from working together prior to emergencies. And so the Center for Food Preservation Arts goal is all about growing together through the community of food.
All right, thanks, Hal. I'm going to close the poll real quick.
Sure.
And just wanted to let you know, it looks like we have mostly beginners today who don't know a whole lot about the Center for Food Preservation Arts. So do with that what you will, and I will close this poll so it's not in our way anymore. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you can see some pictures from some of the activities that we do. Canning parties where people produce things for themselves, workshops where we're basically teaching. A few of them even include whole families. Preserving for the hungry workshops where we produce jams and jellies and applesauce for the smaller food banks and feeding ministries and community meals that don't get as much agency support. And then also we just sometimes have a lot of fun. But until March of 2020, our programs included all of those activities in a hands-on capacity. But when the lockdown came, we were forced to pivot most of our activities to online, and including workshops like this today. But we were very fortunate in that our Preserving for the Hungry program was considered to be an essential support. I always have trouble with saying that phrase, essential support for food banks and other emergency food systems. So we were allowed to continue holding those events, but at a much reduced level. And now that it's starting to look like there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully it's not another train, we can look forward to getting back to more hands-on events and welcoming new and returning volunteers. But now let's get to the topic that you all came here for. Freezing is in essence nature's pause button. I love that quote because it defines where we're starting from. We're going to talk a lot about freezing fresh produce, whether it's from our gardens or from community gardens or even stores. And the thing about produce is that the minute that it's harvested, it begins to lose its nutrients, its vitamins. It begins to lose color and taste within a few hours. But freezing will slow or even stop that process. And the Department of Agriculture suggests that if you do it properly and it is properly stored, it will keep the majority of the nutrients and taste and color and texture for up to 25 years. And what are the characteristics of freezing? Well, it relies on manipulating temperature, moisture, and exposure to the air. It binds the water in crystals, and that crystallization of the water stops a lot of the growth of bacteria and molds and other pathogens. And the faster you can freeze it, both in terms from fresh into frozen, but also dropping the temperature down, the smaller the crystals. And smaller crystals, when it defrosts, don't affect the texture as much as if it is a very, very slow freeze and the crystals are larger. Also, you want to always protect a frozen product from the air, because I'm sure you're probably familiar with freezer burn. And freezer burn is when, like through the natural fluctuations in any freezer, even if it's functioning properly, there's a slight increase in temperature and a slight drop, like if you're opening and closing the freezer or just natural cycling. And that causes some of the ice crystals on the surface to vaporize and move off, and that starts drawing water out from the actual product. And so you get freezer burn. And that's actually the beginning of freeze drying, which is a separate process from just regular freezing. But coming back to it, I'm sure if you have had any experience with food handlers cards or going through any kind of safety training, you'd be familiar with this chart, which shows the really important temperatures related to freezing. Now, most of the time, the best range to keep food frozen is from 0 to -10. But our regular freezers, not very many of them will go below 0, but that's fine. But 10, because -10 up to 32 degrees is where we're actually getting the efficient freezing that slows down the bacterias. But it's important that we remember that frozen food is basically uncooked. Or even if it's a leftover and you've cooked it, you need to be careful with it when it defrosts, because the danger zone is between 40 degrees and 140 degrees. And that's when the molds, bacteria, and yeasts that have basically been hibernating will come back to life and start partying and multiplying like crazy. Now we can go ahead. So some of the, you always have to list pros and cons. I was told when you're doing one of these presentations, that's very useful, and it really is. We've already discussed about how we want to kill or slow down the bacteria. Home freezing is still the fastest and easiest way to keep produce and other foods nutrient dense. It's convenient because you can freeze the food in the size and the quantity that you know you're going to be using. And avoiding the salts and artificial preservatives that you get in some. But before we go to the next slide, I'd like to add one that I should have put on this slide a long time ago. It's really important to use freezing and other preservation techniques to help reduce food waste, to keep food that is still viable out of the landfills so that we're not basically throwing away an important resource. And if you've got pros, you have to have cons. The process itself, some of the pre-treatment things we're going to discuss, and just the process of freezing, some of the vitamins will be lost. In most cases, it's negligible. The storage of it requires electric power, which is a risk if the power goes off. You may need to do some investment in other equipment. A vacuum sealer helps, but it's not essential. But you're going to need some containers, things like that, to store it in the way that you find most useful. And then I'm not going to keep coming back to this for sure. When defrosting, it needs to be at 40 degrees or less. Treat the food as if it's raw. And the qualities that make the produce appetizing will eventually start to degrade. If you have something in the freezer for 15 years, it is going to taste and look and smell a little bit different. That's why they recommend with a lot of things that the time that you should keep it for best quality. It's sort of like the best by date that you find on commercial products. For the best taste and all of those things is around somewhere between a year and 6 months. But things will be fine for a long, long time. Go ahead. Thank you. I'm going to briefly just go over these kind of as bullet points because we're going to discuss each of them in a little bit more detail. You want to select the best produce available and the freshest. Want to clean to make sure that you eliminate dirt and possibly some chemicals if you're not in control of growing it. You may have some pesticides and things. You cut it to size. Some things need to be peeled. You need to pre-treat to stop the enzyme actions because both vegetables and fruits will start to degrade. Fruits, the sign of that is like cut apples as an example, will start to brown. Vegetables will get very limp and they will also start to deteriorate in taste if they're not pre-treated. And then we're going to talk just a little bit about packaging and labeling. I don't know how many times I've gotten something out of the back of the refrigerator, thought it was one thing, and then when I've defrosted it, it's something entirely different. So the date and all of those things are very important. Could you back up to the last slide, please? Thank you. And then there's the principle of first in, first out, or FIFO. That would help me not to pull something out that I don't know what exactly or when exactly it went in. All right, let's go ahead. So preparing the produce. You want to pick it the freshest possible. In the future, I'm going to be rearranging some of these slides because what you see here is a bowl of kale that I harvested last year at about this time out of what carried over in my winter garden. And so this is really, really fresh. And in the future, I'm going to use this as an example of the life history through all the steps. But this was harvested within the 6 to 12 hours and frozen that they recommend. If you want to make sure you help reduce bacteria, especially things that are firm skinned and you're not going to be peeling them, you want to soak them in a solution of 3 to 1 of water and like white vinegar for 5 to 10 minutes. Soft fruit, you don't want to soak things that berries like raspberries, blackberries, but you rinse them thoroughly under running water. And then you prepare it into the size and shape you want. Now, pre-treatment is a little bit different than the washing process. This is what happens to stop the enzyme action and just not clean and remove bacteria and dirt. So vegetables need to be steamed or blanched. We won't go into a lot of detail on that because it's pretty easy to find information on steaming and blanching. And we have a link, as you probably see, on a really good article about blanching vegetables. Then there's also the fruits. Fruits, especially when they are peeled, like apples, the enzyme action starts to make them go brown. And so you stop that, or at least slow it down, with adding an acid of some kind, an edible acid, like ascorbic acid or lemon or lime juice. But I might mention that everyone, they suggest the acidity of citrus juices that you would like squeeze right out of a lemon or lime, it varies wildly. So anytime it's calling for lime or lemon juice, they suggest that you use the bottled because it's been standardized, and the very few stabilizers, preservatives they put in are just a natural chemical. And so they are been deemed harmless. And I believe they truly are because they're in such an incredibly small amount. And so the percentage that they talk about, which is in one of the links that you saw, is talking in this case to a 1-to-1. So if you're going to soak the fruits for a couple to 5 minutes, it would be like 1 part lemon juice to 1 part water. Ascorbic acid in the link, they give you the percentages of what you should use with that. And this was just one of the slides that I'll incorporate later into the life history of kale going in the freezer. But this is, I was fortunate enough to be early on, I got an asparagus steamer, which is that mesh cylinder there that fits right down into a pot where there's very little space that you can steam it without boiling it, which is really the best way because that helps keep a lot of the minerals and nutrients in it. Boiling pulls a lot more out of it. But then the nice thing of it is after you have blanched it, you always want to cool it very quickly so that it doesn't continue cooking. And that would be done by dropping it into an ice water bath. And so before we go on to containers and other parts, are there any other questions that have come up into the chat?
No questions in the chat just yet, but I would encourage folks to put your questions in the chat as they come up. And if you're having trouble using the chat, raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can ask your question live. So I encourage you to do that too if you're struggling with the chat and Q&A functions. I know those are hard if you're on your phone. But yeah, keep going, Hal.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we had some opportunity there. And like I said, I really do encourage people to ask questions as we go along. So sometimes everything is just really happens fast. Like when I'm harvesting beans in the middle of summer and I know I'm going to be freezing them, I sometimes don't have to think about, have time to think about, well, I'm going to want a mixture of just 1 part of yellow string beans to 3 parts green string beans, and I want them in this portion, et cetera, et cetera. So I can just, blanch them, rinse them, cool them off, and then put them on a tray. And then when I put them in bags, I will break them up into the proportions. But sometimes you know exactly where you're going to be going with something, and so that you can pick the container up ahead and use that. Now, the important thing is you're going to want to be sure that whatever you use for your container is going to keep air out of it. And traditionally, to remove air and keep it out, we've used a lot of things like Ziploc baggies. And now that they're designed for the freezer with sometimes like the double strip to seal it in really well, they work really, really well, but you have to get the air completely out of it. And so we have a link that if it isn't going, there it is, yeah. It's really a clever way to remove air, and it's a little short video for you to play that you fill the bag and you close it, the zip, and it really has to be a Ziploc, not one of the flap ones, but the zip to just about an inch, and then gently push it down into a container of water. And that pushes in against the sides and pushes all the air out, and you hold it stable and zip it the rest of the way. And you can do that over and over again as you remove some of the product and use it. But then, of course, if you have one, there are different kinds of vacuum packers for the home. They usually come with a package originally of some pre-made sized bags. The most economic way is to buy rolled bags. I would warn people that not all rolls of bags are equal. Some of them are a much lower quality, like we discovered this year, where there was a shortage of canning jar lids and people were getting lids that were just fake. They're an inferior products. And so you can each get rolls that are inferior. But if you get them of the brand that goes with the machine that you purchased, they'll pretty much always be of a high quality. And I love it because these peaches you see here were just kind of thrown in, but you can pre-freeze, just like you saw on the trays, as individual pieces, put them in either the Ziploc or the vacuum pack bag and seal it, and they stay as pieces if you don't leave them out of the freezer too long. You can carefully cut open the Ziploc, remove what you need, and then refreeze it after you've pulled the air out of it. Now, these are a couple of methods. That the dry pack was one where people were usually, they weren't pre-treating the fruits. And so they would sprinkle sugar on, which would draw some of the water to the surface and stabilize the fruit. Or they would like put on like ascorbic acid powder or something. And some folks still do that. But also what's more popular in these is if you know you're going to be using it, like say, you know, eventually you're going to be making the peaches into a peach pie filling or something like that, is a wet pack where you put it into a container, usually some type of a sealable jar, and you can put fruit juice on it or a sugar syrup or even just straight water that keeps the air out, and it suspends it as individual pieces, and then you can freeze it like that. I'm going to have to mute my mic here for just a second. Ah, yes, spring, the allergies. I only have allergies during the heights of the seasons, so basically February through January. So freezing in jars works really well, but as you can see the cursor that's floating around there, there are jars now that are specifically say they're freezer safe. Now, people have been freezing in jars forever, but they would notice if they didn't make sure that the jars they were freezing in were always used for freezing, if they bounced back and forth between freezing and water bath or pressure canning, oftentimes in the pressure or water bath, they might find the jars would break. That's because the way the glass was made, it was not prepared for that. And as it moved back and forth from extreme cold to extreme heat, it would lose what's called the temper, and it would become more fragile and break. So always look for the ones that say freezer safe, or if you're unsure, try to segregate the ones that you use for freezing so that you don't accidentally can in them again. And this is just a little useful diagram that shows a suggestion for the freeze fill line, because you know things expand when they freeze. It's usually below the bottom rim. Almost all jars have that bottom rim, but some of the jars you can see here, like the really squat half pint ones, you need to add a little extra space. But there are charts everywhere for that. Now, as mentioned on the 22nd, there's going to be another workshop on herbs, including a small section about freezing. And I believe that one's being taught by Jenny, but it's a really great workshop, and I would recommend you see it. So this works really well with leafy herbs and things like that, because if they are exposed to air in the frozen condition, they freeze or burn really quickly, and then they turn black and turn into mush. So you want to freeze them in a way that they stay, so that they're not exposed to any air and get that kind of freeze or burn reaction. So one of the best ways to do it is either the whole leaves, like you see that I've put in ice cubes to put into drinks, even just fruit juices during the summer, or chopped up. This is basil that the intention is to preserve it, to be making pestos and other things out of later on when I have time. So the herbs are going to float, and that's okay, because it's the prolonged exposure to the dry air in the freezer. You let it float a little bit. When it's frozen solid, you take out the ice cube tray or the jar or whatever you're using and pour in enough water to cover any of the leaves that have floated up. But you can also use something besides water, and that's really useful. Because if you've ever accidentally, and I'm assuming nobody deliberately has tried to freeze fresh mushrooms untreated, once again, it just turns into mush. But what you need to do with things like mushrooms and sometimes with eggplant is remove a portion of that water through sauteing them in something like oils or butter. If you are strictly vegan, there are a lot of different oils, like coconut oil you could use, or olive oil. But if you're going to use them like I do to put onto a cut of meat, and yes, I am a carnivore, sauteing them in butter, and then when the water has been drawn out from them, then bagging them up and freezing them. But you could also, in that butter, you could also have herbs that are coated with the butter or the oil. And then you're one step ahead in your seasoning, as shown in the next slide, where we can see all the different varieties.
Hal, it looks like your screen is frozen. Maybe we'll just give you a moment to see if I can get your computer back online and functioning here. But Hal was just saying that here you can see a bunch of different herbs prepared in olive oil or melted butter before you put them into the freezer. Yeah, looks like Hal's having some computer issues, but maybe we can pause here for a moment for questions, and maybe Judy, you can answer questions if anyone has some. I think it's really cool to prepare, especially something like basil in olive oil, so then it's really very ready for pesto. So I think that's a great combination. I haven't tried freezing herbs in water, but that also seems like it could be useful.
While we're waiting, I'll throw in, I have not tried this with freezing, but Sass Ruth Van, for those of you that have attended workshops at the Enviro House, Sass always taught a lot about herbs and making pesto, and her her garden workshops, and she was making pesto out of all kinds of things. One of the best that I tasted, and I almost liked it better than basil, was celery leaves.
Oh,
She grows celery as part of her CSA, and so she would pull the celery leaves off, and it has a wonderful flavor. But she was trying, experimenting all different kinds of herbs and greens and so on that she could make pesto out of. So, experiment, play around a little bit.
yeah, celery leaves seems like a great idea too for reducing your food waste, because normally you wouldn't do anything with the celery leaves
Yeah.
since you're just harvesting the stalks. I've used kale and spinach to make pestos, and I think both turn out pretty well. And I've played around with the nut as well. So I don't always use pine nuts because they're so expensive.
Yeah.
But I use sunflower seeds, and I've used cashews as well. If you soak cashews for a few hours, they get soft enough to turn into pesto too.
Oh, you can do an awful lot with spinach that we don't think about. And it's interesting. Uh, Hi, I'm the communications manager for CFVA, and I've been running the slides and being silent, but now I don't get to. I have a book that my mom kept as a teenager, where she wrote down all of my grandmother's recipes. And it was interesting that you made the comment about celery leaves. My grandmother put celery leaves in things. I mean, in her recipes, she didn't just separate the stalks. So this would have been probably written down probably in the 30s.
Yes.
So we have different ideas now sometimes about what we can use and what we can't use. I think celery leaves are underrated.
Yeah.
Okay.
Speaking of freezing, extra veggies and things like that, my
That's okay.
friends
Just
own.
go ahead and use
Sorry,
the
Janda, you're probably talking to Hal on the phone right now.
Mhm.
But my friends often keep their like broccoli stalks and things like that in the freezer, and then make them into broccoli potato soup in the winter. So
Mhm.
I think that's a great way too, to things that we may think of as scrap can really go into something else, and keeping them in the freezer is a great way of saving them up for those future recipes.
Mhm. Oh, and here comes Hal. And sometimes it can be a cultural thing. For example, I woke up. I grew up with my mom only using the white part of green onions, but my college roommate, who was from Hawaii and came from an Asian background, always used the whole thing. I mean, just took off the roots, and she used the green and the white. So, and here's Hal back.
Yes, I have no idea. I wasn't touching a thing. My internet connection just went south and I had to reboot my computer. Well, anyway, Simon and Garfunkel, parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, and then the sound of silence. All right. I look forward to seeing the recording to find out how you covered for me. Thank you. So this is one of the slides that I'll be incorporating into the life history of kale and chard as it goes into freezing. But I like to blanch it, drain it well, and then put it in 1 cup portions. And I've found these incredible silicone baking mats. I think if you do a lot of freezing as well as baking, or even dehydrating, they're a great investment. And then I freeze them with a little extra room in a vacuum pack bag, and then I can just take out what I need and re-vacuum seal it. Other ways to portion things would be to make purees out of them. Now, something you have here, let's see, strawberry puree that has a little lemon juice added to keep the color. We have big tray to the side there of fig purees. And then we have some lemon puree. And also I tried for the first time making a squash puree and freezing it. And for whatever reason that I'm not sure of, that's the one that came out turning really brown, but it was very tasty. And I dumped all of those out with some chicken stock and made a butternut squash soup. So that works really well. Then there are things that people usually don't think that it's going to be easy to freeze. Now, if you I don't know, I grew up in southeastern Idaho, and so I, as a school kid, ended up working the potato harvests, and sometimes potatoes didn't get out of the ground fast enough, And if you've ever seen a potato that's frozen without any preparation, it turns into a black mush. And so that's not something you want to happen to your hash browns or your mashed potatoes. So the essence is to stop the enzyme process. And with things that you're going to use in pieces or shreds of the potato, what you're going to want to do is blanch them just like we would any other vegetable. So let's go ahead to the next one and show you the recipe. This is available to you if you review this, but there's also a link to our YouTube video of it. So you shred them, put them in cold water to soak off some of the excess starch, blanch them, cool them, put them on a parchment or silicone lined tray, spread an even layer or form into patties, do a second pat dry, freeze until solid, package, and store. Now, because of the way the air may seal in, they suggest, Department of Agriculture's recipe, that Ziplocs don't seal out as much air, so they suggest 3 months, vacuum sealed up to a year. Now, freezing mashed potatoes, if you just mashed them up, they also would then, they're cooked, but they would start losing a lot of their texture. They become grainy if they're defrosted. So what you need to do with like mashed potatoes, or you can see I have a bag that's was made with half turnip and half mashed potatoes to bring the carbs down. You could do the same thing with potatoes and mixing them with cauliflower to reduce the carbs. But the secret is you're going to need a stabilizer, and it's going to need to be some type of oil. And as you can see, the next recipe is just a totally indulgent recipe, because you can see it not only has the potatoes, but it has a lot of oils and several different kinds of oils. And so this is a real splurge, but just even a little butter or a little other kind of oil that you might like to use will do that stabilizing effect. And that's another thing. Eggs are another thing you can freeze. But with those, what you want to do is add some stabilizer also, or they will tend to be rubbery. Well, they're all going to be kind of rubbery. They're not the kind of thing that you're going to be using in any way except for scrambled eggs or as an ingredient in baking. But if you know you're going to be using them in something that's savory, you want to put a little bit of salt as a stabilizer and then whip it up. You can do the egg whites and the egg yolk separately, or you can put them together as you see in the ice cube tray and the bottom of the muffin tin. But then if you want to use them in baking and you know you're going to use them in something sweet, you can stabilize with a little bit of sugar. And just looking ahead to storing all this wonderful stuff, best at 0 degrees or lower if possible. And full freezers, especially chest freezers, are more efficient. And in the case of a power failure, a full chest freezer, if you keep it closed, pretty much everything in there will stay frozen 3 days or a little bit more. Labeling, very important, the item, the date, the portion size. And sometimes if you have special instructions, like it is something you had stabilized with sugar or salt, or you had mashed potatoes and you know you have a friend that's a vegan and won't eat dairy, you want to make sure that you label those that they've been stabilized either with non-dairy product or with dairy products. And then FIFO, first in, first out. And then as promised, we're briefly going to touch in how to freeze leftovers. And there's some great articles, including by budgetbites.com, that is promoted there, but it's also in our list of links, I believe. So freezing leftovers, these are both the pros and cons. Freezing leftovers save you a lot of money. and it helps reduce food waste. Unfortunately, there are some things that are pretty consistent in terms of whether they freeze well or not, but it's not always a clear line. So sometimes you just have to rely on a recipe that somebody gives you, or you have to just try it. There's no definite cutoff for how long those things will keep, up to 25 years, but remembering all the things about proper defrosting. And once they're defrosted, not leaving them at room temperature longer than 2 hours. And always follow the tested guidelines, and when in doubt, throw it out. And the steps are, you want to find a recipe that you like, and a lot of them nowadays, especially on the bigger websites like All Recipes or other ones like that, will give you not only a recommendation whether it freezes well or not, but how long and the best way to freeze it. You want to pack it in useful portions, the size you're going to use. Like originally I started, if I had like, let's say a couple of pints of a soup, I would freeze it all as one big unit. And I live alone, and I usually don't have dinner guests that I'm feeding frozen leftovers to. So that was just overkill, and I'd end up eating it for several days in a row. So now I freeze it in much smaller quantities. And if you like, there's a lot of different kinds of silicone molds that you can use. Anything up from a 1/4 cup that are basically kind of ice cube tray size, all the way up to 2-cup silicone molds. And if you keep your eyes open, they don't have to be that expensive to get. But just start out practicing. You can use old, let's say, small yogurt containers to freeze some stuff in, and then dump it out and seal it up in a bag or vacuum pack it, if you just want to find out if this is something that's going to be useful to you as a way to deal with food. Label and date, thaw it properly, don't leave it out at room temperature. And once again, when in doubt, throw it out. Don't risk it. This is kind of general guidelines of items that freeze well. Harkening back to the things that there's no clear line, this list includes soups and stews, casseroles. Well, if it is a cream-based soup, it's a 50-50 chance it may not defrost well. And by not defrosting well, I mean texture. Texture may go south in different ways. Pasta, if it's in a sauce, tomato paste, pestos, cooked beans, rice, whole grains, any legumes, but they need to be cooked. Fresh fruit, smoothies, bake, and vegetables that you know you're going to be recooking or using fairly soon in stir fries, things like that. Even green beans, if you defrost them, they're not just the same as crunching down on a fresh green bean. They don't work quite as well in salads because of the texture, but anything where you're going to do a little bit more cooking with it, that works well. Things that don't freeze, as we've kind of alluded to, anything that contains a lot of cream sauces, not as an ingredient, but as the main part. Gelatins. I don't know if you've ever tried freezing Jell-O, but that's like turning it into a rubber ball in my experience. Mayonnaise, sour creams, things that are high water content. Now, the mushrooms, the eggplants, that's a little bit different because we have a way to prep it, but you can't really saute cucumbers and lettuce to draw it out. Now, chards, kale, things like that are, and even cabbage is a little stronger cell structures so that they will freeze if they're properly prepared. Some people have tried freezing eggs and shells. That doesn't work. It expands, makes a terrible mess before it freezes to the bottom of your freezer. And then I've even heard of people who have tried to freeze canned goods in the can. It's sort of like if you try to cool a can of soda really quickly and you forget about it, you know the kind of mess it'll make. And so we have about 3 screens of different links that I think you'll find very useful. This Freezing Summer's Bounty, and this is the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And that's like one of the gold standards for recipes and guidelines, because it's all based on USDA and FDA, but it is an independent nonprofit. So if you want to look them up, you can certainly find that they're looking for donations. But yeah, the National Center for Home Food Preservation is like a gold standard. The Spruce Eats, .com. I have a lot, I use the Spruce Eats a lot. They're sort of like a Wikipedia of all different kinds of things, and they've collected them into categories like home, decor, food, food preservation. So we have a couple of them in a row there from Spruce Eats. Serious Eats, they have a lot of, like you would call, hacks, a lot of like kitchen hacks, different ways. And they're very short, but very useful videos. Budget Bites, as I alluded to before, that's a good article. Freezing Eggs, What's Cooking in America has a really good thing on that. We didn't go into much detail about freezing dairy, but a lot of that is covered here in the this dairy discovery zone, because it gives you guidelines on how you can pull off freezing some of those things, including cheese. And freezing herbs, simply canning is another great resource. And then our video of freezing potatoes, an FDA generated refrigerator and freezer storage chart, and then guidelines from the National Center for Home Food Preservation again on thawing things safely. And then the last is ways to contact us and me directly. The website, which has a lot of articles, posts of interests, articles that we might reference on our Facebook page, but go into greater depth on all different kinds of things. And then our YouTube channel, we're up to over, I believe it's 24, 26 videos now, enough that we're going to be starting to develop some playlists on them. Right now we're working on completing a dehydrating series, and it's going to have maybe ultimately about 10 different videos. And then the best way right now, because we're not a nonprofit, but we work collaboratively, is if you have the desire to make donations of supplies or funds, they're always needed to help us in our Preserving for the Hungry program. And if you contact me directly at the email, I'll direct you, if you're interested in tax deductions, to the proper partner that is a nonprofit. And now this, whoops.
I just launched a poll question there to find out if anyone has experience or equipment they would like to volunteer potentially or donate to CFPA, since you were just talking about donating supplies and canning materials and things like that. So I'll leave that open for a minute, but Hal, you can keep talking.
Questions. We're also very interested in questions. We've got some time here. This moved even with the unexpected little commercial break that we had. So I apologize again for that, but I have no idea. I wasn't even touching the computer. So
it happens.
All right. So
Hal, one of the things we touched on in the break while you were dealing with your computer was Sasser Thuns using celery leaves to make pesto, and using that in a lot of different ways because she grows celery for her CSA.
Sure. There's also parsley pesto. Pesto is sort of one of those things. It's like the term ketchup, or the term, what is another one? It's a condiment basically, or it's treated as a sauce, and it can be made a lot of different ways. Like I was just shocked to discover there's even mushroom ketchup. So, all
I've
right.
never heard of that. I'm going to close this poll question we have open right now, but it does look like we've got one attendee who's interested in becoming a volunteer with CFPA, and maybe some folks who are interested in volunteering in the future, but not right now. So again, I would say check out the website, email Hal at cfpapreserve@gmail.com. That email address is in the chat as well and on the screen here. Definitely get in contact about volunteering. That'd be great.
Yes, and as things are starting to open up, we're definitely going to be able to expand beyond the limit of 5 people for every event and start having demonstrations. So keep looking for that light. And then this is something that it's just become a tradition. I have to use this somewhere in every presentation.
Let me throw in before we get off, and Kyla has another question to answer or to ask. But I also want to remind people of the upcoming webinars and the contact information for the EnviroHouse is, I believe, in there, ehouse@cityoftacoma.org. If you want to suggest other topics that you're interested in that you would like us to explore, if they can be done by a webinar. So stay tuned and hopefully you will come back again. And then Kyla, you have a couple questions, and Hal may have some closing remarks too.
Yeah, I have some closing questions here for our attendees to respond to. So, now having attended this webinar, how confident do you feel in your ability to freeze your own food? And then also, just for future reference, it'd be great to know what other food preservation skills you'd be interested in learning so that we can host another one of these webinars with CFPA. So I'll leave that open for a minute here. Hal, I saw in your recommendations for things that are good for freezing. I think you touched on most of them, but we didn't talk about freezing bread. And I wondered if you have anything to share there about tips for freezing bread.
Oh yeah, I kind of glossed over that because it's a piece of cake.
Great.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It is really the most important thing with that, though, is to realize that it is going to be a little bit tougher. But if you want to freeze it and maintain the best quality, do the tray in a single level. Don't leave it too long, just enough so that it's firmer, and then vacuum seal it. If you just vacuum seal it before you freeze it, you're just going to squish it into a mass. Because I tried that with half a loaf one time, and it was like a ball by the time I finished, a square ball of dough. But yeah, you're always going to lose some of the moisture out of it. So some people, I've been told, do the thing about when they take the slices out, if it's toughened up a little bit, put it in a paper bag, sprinkle some water on it, microwave it 30 seconds or so.
I did that and it works.
Yeah, it's never bothered me. I mean, I actually just use the Ziploc baggie and the water trick to push as much air out as possible and not worry about it too much. But my mother was the one who, because she was a charge nurse and usually never knew what shift she was going to be on, she made like full sandwiches except for the lettuce and froze them. And she didn't use many techniques, and they were dry, and I found them unpalatable, but worked for her.
Yeah, I was thinking I started keeping my like sliced sandwich bread in the freezer. Not that it's in there for very long, I'm not freezing it for months and months, but because it's very difficult for me to finish a whole loaf of bread on my own before it starts to go moldy. So, and I usually toast my bread. So I find taking pre-sliced bread out of the freezer and popping it straight into the toaster works fine for me. It's maybe a little bit drier than it would be otherwise, but yeah, I haven't tried it though with like loaf loaf bread or a heartier bread that I might actually want to preserve more of the flavor or texture of. I pretty much just use it for sandwich bread.
One thing that, I don't know, if you're only freezing a few slices and you go to get them out and what you've stored in is leaked a little bit, you may find that there's like ice on it. Don't ignore that. Scrape it off, or after it defrosts, you just have a big spot of dough where all that water was, because it's drawing like a lot of moisture out from the whole loaf and dumping it one place.
One thing I want to add too that it just occurred to me, I see in the answers to the poll questions, several people want to know more about dehydrating. And until we get to a point of doing another webinar, or Hal has those on his website, we also have a couple of how-to videos that Hal did with us on how to dehydrate foods. And you can find those in the YouTube playlist lineup. The link is in the chat. If you go to youtube.com/City of Tacoma /EnviroHouse, you can find the playlist on the videos, the webinars, and on all the 26, 28 how-to videos that we've already produced. So check those out.
Yeah, I wanted to say one thing about that video. I really want to do another one that is a little bit more like this, and hopefully we'll be able to do at least a portion of it live, so there's live demo and interact. Anyway, those are plans for the future. But the ones that is posted right now was originally intended to have a second part, because it was all leading up to basically making your own ready-to-eat meals for backpacking or emergencies. And it only basically goes through the introduction. It doesn't go through the actual dehydrating techniques. But if you know something about dehydrating, it's pretty simple then to put it together with the techniques we share in that one. If not, there'll be more, definitely more. Like I said, we're going to have a whole series on dehydrating in minute and possibly painful detail.
Pickling is also something that came up. People are interested in hearing more about. So I think, do we have some pickling videos in the how-tos already, Janda?
We do not, but we will be doing a webinar with Hal on pickling sometime in July. We haven't set the date yet. We're trying to figure out when we can do it, so it will be a couple of weeks in advance of when the cucumbers and all the vegetables that you would want to pickle are ready to work with.
Yes, I always try to get out ahead of the harvest season, but you know, honestly, the seasons have been changing off and on, so it's hard to gauge. But on our YouTube channel, we have at least 2, if not 3 different specific ones, like pickling asparagus and some things like that.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to say, for those who are asparagus fans, we're almost at the end of asparagus season, and we have just been featuring that video, which we made last year, about pickling asparagus, and I highly recommend it.
Great, thank you so much.
Figure out how we can link to that, Kyla. So, okay, well, I think that I don't see any other questions. Do we have anything else that we need to put in the poll, or are we done here?
I think we're good.
Yeah,
But thanks
I'm
so much
happy.
for joining us.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you all very much. Please be in touch, and you know, we're going to be continuing to produce content and move back into the real world as soon as possible.
And the EnviroHouse will probably be doing a lot of webinars yet this year, because our space is so small. I don't anticipate being able to do in-person workshops for several more months. So keep checking out the workshop page, and we'll have everything we can up there. So thanks all for coming, and we will stop recording and close out our video now, and see you all next time.